know some stuff. All right, any questions, any suggestions, ideas, feedback, comments, anything? Good for now? All right, let's get it started then.
Okay. Yeah, so the first paper is going over the history of various research throughout the years over speech science and speech production. And the way that the paper is formatted is through 7 different myths that have been debunked throughout history. And so we're just going to go in order of 1 through 7 of what those myths are and what they did to disprove them. So the first one is kind of some background about what they had talked about and what they classify as speech production, speech perception. And so in the paper, they state that speech is not just the actual auditory and verbalizations, but it starts at the beginning of conception of idea. And so speech is not just the audio being perceived by the listener, but it's the thoughts that come in your head that moves into motor planning and then motor execution, and then the waveforms going through the air and then into the listener's ear. And so speech is the whole process, not just what you can hear or perceive out in the world. And so research has evolved in various ways to define what speech is and how we can classify it. And so the first myth that is discussed is going through that speech is made of sounds with pauses and spaces in between words. And so back in the 30s, the initial belief was that speech is distinct sounds strung together to make an individual word. And then in between those words, there are pauses and they're separate spaces of sound. And so while this theory was developed, they end up creating various forms and models of what they presumed articulation and speech to be. And around the 40s and 50s, they created what we call a spectrograph or spectrogram, which I will show here in a minute. And so these spectrograms showed that there actually are not pauses between words, with some exceptions. And the exceptions are due to the type of consonants that exist in the English language. And so there are some sounds that do have natural pauses after them. So things like P, B, D, T, things that are basically a hard sound with a push of air afterwards. And those are called stopping sounds. And so there is a stop in between those words or in between those sounds. But traditionally, there is not spaces in between every single word or syllable within a conversation or within a phrase. The third thing that they ended up discovering was that speech sounds are not independent of each other, but they actually do co-articulate and they do interact. So for instance, co-articulation basically means that the first sound is impacted by the sound following it. So for instance, if you're saying the word school versus the word sky, your mouth will automatically move to prepare for the O sound versus the I sound. And so your lips will round versus going out bigger like you're smiling. And so co-articulation is basically saying that of your mouth and your motor planning processes will adjust for the following sounds and not just independently saying each sound on its own. And so here we have a spectrograph that is in the paper and in the article if you want to look at it from a better view or better angle. But here they had a woman saying we're shopping for sundresses, and you can see how the very bottom row or the x-axis has the time of how long it took her to say it, whereas the y-axis is the frequencies and intensity of it. And so in a color scale spectrograph, you would see blue as the lowest intensity, whereas red is the highest. In a gray scale like this one, white is the lowest intensity, so no sound or very little sound, whereas black is the most intense, so the loudest sound of where the highest intensity and frequency is. And so what you can see here is the very top is just like the speech form and the speech wave, whereas the bottom has the extended or the more detailed spectrograph, and showing how if you look underneath the bottom, I don't know if I have a laser pointer. Oh, I do. There it is on the screen. Okay, so if you look at the bottom here, you can see how there are very few spaces in between. This is called the vocal bar or the voicing bar, where you can see your voice is on during these things. You can see on the P and on the D here, there are spaces because this is the hard stop for the D and for the P. And so there is a break in the voicing bar down here, but for things like the we are shopping, there's no break here. And then for sundresses, there's also no break here between the R and the S. And so these show no co-articulation, where you have the blue arrows here on this side, on the very bottom left. You can see the we're shopping, how the your lips will be moving to round for the SH sound compared to just saying we're on its own. Saying we're shopping, your mouth will articulate a little bit differently. And so,
Wait,
yeah, what's up? Not yet, but
sorry.
what's up?
I have a question about this graph.
Yeah, go for it.
My question, what are the units on the bottom half, the y-axis? It's like frequency, right?
The y-axis is frequency, the x-axis is time, and so it's in milliseconds.
So, question is, does it matter to know the actual value it takes along y-axis? Is that important?
It will be in a minute, and I'll explain that then.
Okay.
Yeah. So there are different things called formants in a spectrograph or spectrogram, and that tells you different things about it. So for instance, one is vowels, one is high versus low pitch, and then one is R coloring. So whenever you make a vowel sound with or without R, the way that you produce it is different. And so that's actually brought up in the next myth that we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, so those on the side, they do matter for frequency, and there's also different thickness or different intensity of bars that you can kind of see within it. And those are in different levels, relate to different parts of sound and how it comes out of your mouth and out of your vocal tract. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I just asked more so because I mean, I didn't see the number.
Yeah, they cut it off in the paper as well. Yeah.
Okay, because, I don't know, does everybody just kind of have like a good idea, just like looking at it without numbers, is like, like, is that how it works?
I think it's by relative to each other. So
Yeah.
you get a sense of Ops are always like this, fricatives are always like.
Mhm.
And then after a while, I guess, not paying attention to the actual.
Yeah.
Should.
Yeah, so fricatives are ones that are like friction, so F, S, Z, SH. So you can see here how it's a thicker bar going all the way up. Whereas the P, it's kind of more on the lower end of it. There's not as much friction or air coming out of it. And so you can see the intensity and the frequency of the sound just based on how it's produced. And that's just how people articulate various sounds for whatever reason.
I guess, yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
just I'm using that red line. I'm not sure
Mhm.
if I'm supposed to, but I'm using that almost like the threshold to talk about stopping gap. And I don't know if you guys are thinking that way,
Mhm.
like for Pa and D, like P and D, they
Yeah.
have like, you know, like white and like shadow kind of thing
Mhm.
is different. It's not, it's below that red line.
Yeah.
So you're saying if it's below, it's more likely to be
Stopping gap.
a what?
It's more likely to be a low frequency sound. And so I can jump ahead a little bit actually, because this is one of the other slides.
So I guess my question for the class is like, is everybody familiar with the concept of formant frequencies? How many people know what formant frequencies are? Sort of.
You gotta-
I do. So that's what so I do have slides over that as well. So these are basically different formants. So there's three different types of formants. F1 is the very bottom one. This is the lowest type of frequency in resonance. And so this is within vowel height. So for instance, there are so many vowels in the English language that we say. And so there are some that are either a higher sound like I versus E. And so the E sound is a higher frequency than the ah sounds a lower frequency. And so you can see the difference here of the different vowels here. So the oo, ah, and a, they all are different angles and different heights just based on what the sound is and if it's a higher sound or a lower sound. Formant 2 is back versus front. So for instance, sounds like T versus K is different, or even in different vowels here, E versus oo. The E is a front sound, whereas the oo is a back sound. You can see how the formants on number 2 is lower for backing sounds, where on the fronting sounds, they're higher. And then the third formant, which isn't on here, is related to R. And so if there's an R sound at the end of it for like R versus A, you would see a third formant line that would be present on the top here somewhere. And so that's what it looks like. Here's kind of a more drawn out version to help it make a bit more sense. And so you can see here, the bottom lines here are formant 1, top lines here are formant 2, and these relate to place of vowels. And so front and back, high and low, different frequencies and intensities of how you say that.
So does that mean that just because B is the common, in
Mhm.
all B's, but like because of the vowel added and different
Yeah.
vowel added,
Mhm.
different F2?
Yeah, and so the vowels here, the little tails on the end, they will either go up or down based on the frequency of the vowel before it. So for instance, D is a lower vowel sound than the I sound, and so it'll angle up, whereas saying D is a higher sound than the oo sound, so it'll angle down here. And so depending on the frequency of what the sound is, will either angle up or down to match the vowels that it's attached to. Any other questions?
You said place, that's like where it's being produced.
Yes. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. So place is where it is in your mouth, your vocal tract of, is it in your front with your lips like saying M, or is it in the back of your throat with like K or G? Yes.
And wait, what is the dotted line? Horizontal dotted line?
Oh, that's just telling you where the frequencies of the sounds are. And so here it's frequency of kilohertz on this side. And so here's about, I'm gonna say 1800 kilohertz, give or take. And then here's about 500 kilohertz, or yeah, 500 hertz. So you can see here, yeah, these are the vowels, and then on the y-axis is a frequency in kilohertz.
What happens after we cross that frequency?
It just keeps on getting louder. There are some sounds that can go up to 5 or 8,000. This is just where they cut it off for the purpose of this graph to make room for it.
So does that mean like G sound has higher frequency than like B sound?
So basically think about the formats as you create a very specific configuration of articulation inside the vocal tract cavity. So any physical property, any physical basically structure has selectivity towards like responding most vigorously to certain frequencies. You just like take a very tall building and you shake it with a certain frequency. If the frequency by which you're shaking that, big building matches the resonant frequency, the building is going to collapse, because the building, completely depending on its mechanical structure, has selectivity to respond to some certain frequencies and dampen some other frequencies, right? So this is a very simple example of understanding resonance, right? Any physical kind of like a structure purely based on its just by mechanical physical properties has the preference towards like responding more vigorously to some certain frequencies and dampening some of the other ones, right? So when you translate the same concept to speech production, now you think about the vocal tract. A vocal tract is a very dynamically adjustable tube. Think about the shape of your pharynx. Think about the shape of your oral cavity, the position of your tongue, how your tongue are like touching the lips or the tips, the teeth, or the velum is elevated or depressed, right? You're just dynamically using the contraction of the muscles, making adjustments to the overall shape of this dynamically adjustable tube, right? And at any certain point, the tube, depending on its current shape and form, is going to have selectivity towards amplifying some certain frequencies and dampening, right? So for example, when you're producing a vowel sound like O versus E versus A, you're just changing the formation, right? And the formant frequencies are those frequencies to which the system most rigorously responds for that particular formation that you're generating. So luckily in the English language, almost all of the vowel sounds can be easily distinguishable from each other by just looking at the pattern by which the energy is being distributed for each vowel sound, right? So for example, on the top plot, when you see the B production compared with the ba or bo, you see different basically frequencies at which the vocal tract is amplifying the harmonic frequencies that are being generated by the vocal cords, right? So that means that, for example, for the boo, the last one on the right side, you're seeing the first and the second formant being relatively close to each other, right? That means that for that particular configuration of the vocal tract, the system has preference towards amplifying the harmonic frequencies that are coming from the vocal folds to amplify those within those frequency ranges as compared to a different vowel sound, right? So formant frequencies are nothing but the preferred frequency of amplification for a given shape and structure of our vocal tract. And how do we do it? During the speech production, we're dynamically moving muscles. Every time that I'm producing different words that involves like different consonants, different vowel sounds, If you think about it, if you take a cross-sectional view of my mouth, I will have some slides for you later on. You're just gonna see that these muscles are just changing their shape and formation over time. You don't sometimes like realize it. I mean, you feel like your tongue is moving and your jaw is moving, right? But you're also changing the overall cross-sectional area of your pharyngeal cavity. That's another tube within which the sound can propagate, and some certain ranges of frequency can get amplified or attenuated, right? So just to put it kind of like a short phrase, formant frequencies are just the resonant frequencies of the human vocal tract system for speech production. And it's a very dynamically changing kind of like, structure, because at any given point, if you take a snapshot, you're gonna see a different formation of this vocal tract. So when we talk about the vocal tract, we're talking about all the structures and all the tubes that sit on top of our larynx, right? So a supralaryngeal space, which is first the pharyngeal cavity and then the oral cavity and the nasal cavity and the lips and the teeth and all that stuff, together make this bulk of the vocal tract cavity that, when dynamically adjusted, is gonna have preference towards either amplifying or attenuating certain frequency ranges. So what you're seeing on that graph is just the formation of those first two formants that are being amplified maximally for any given vowel sound that is being generated, right? Does that make sense? And you just like normally track it over a two-dimensional space. You look at it, the time versus the frequency. At which time point and at what frequencies you're getting the maximal amount of basically amplification of the spectral power of the signal, right? And that's again purely based on mechanical properties of our vocal tract, similar to the building, to the bridge, right? So the people who work in a study like PhD in civil engineering, the ones who go for like earthquake engineering, they're artists to actually design a mechanical system that is least responsive to the common frequencies of an earthquake, right? Because you want to have a bridge that if an earthquake, normally, if they know the range of the frequencies, you don't want the resonant frequency of that bridge to match the frequency of the earthquake. Because if the earthquake happens, then the bridge is going to basically vibrate at its mechanical maximal vibration. It's going to collapse eventually. So the art of civil engineering is to design a bridge that has its resonant frequency away from the frequency of the earthquake, right? But we actually take advantage of that for speech production. You learn through many years of motor learning and motor adaptation to generate a specific configuration of muscle formation in our vocal tract in such a way that we selectively amplify or attenuate certain frequency ranges that are perceivable for our auditory system as, for example, the formant frequencies is specific to different vowel sounds, right? Or you can separate like consonant structures from the vowel sounds. You can look at the transition between the vowel and consonants, right? Some languages use like tonal, basically cues, like for example, Mandarin or Vietnamese languages, that they actually use transition in the frequencies, not like a flat vowel sound that they're generating, right? And that can convey like linguistic meanings. So just to give you some ideas, I'm going to have like some, slides to present you this like idea in more depth, but because you guys have like some question, just to set you up with this idea, and then we're going to discuss it in more detail. But think about like each vowel sound has its own unique frequency ranges at which it's actually selectively amplifying the frequencies depending on the specific configuration of the vocal tract shape that we just basically generate using the movement of muscles in our body, right? Yes. Yes.
So you don't have the consonant first. Well, that would drastically different if that wasn't the case.
It would just have a tail at the end of it. So instead of having the G at the beginning here, it'd just be a tail going down at the end here.
And this is generally how it's always read, though.
Yeah.
Okay. And it doesn't matter if these are all stops. Like, would it be different with fricatives?
Yeah. So with fricatives, if you go back and where are we at? So with fricatives, you can see here that the S and H, there's a higher frequency for it as well, and they're also more intense. There's also not necessarily a hard stop. They blend into the previous sounds, whereas the D, there is a break in the voicing bar and there is a hard stop between it. And so it would be in the frequency and the intensity. It would vary. Yeah.
But it's the same principle for that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So basically for fricatives, what you're doing is that you're generating a specific formation of your vocal tract in such a way that you can actually generate a turbulence, kind of like sounding, like noise like that. When you just like do the F sound, you're not vibrating your vocal folds, you're letting the air to come freely from the space of the open vocal folds. You're not generating like harmonics, right, vibration, by just letting that voice, the sound, the air pass through a certain configuration of the articulatory movement in such a way that you generate like that like high frequency noise like a structure. They can still be distinguished from each other, but because of this turbulence that you're generating in the airflow, you have most of the energy power of the signal distributed over the higher frequency ranges as compared to vowel sounds that have more of the energy distributed over lower frequencies. All right, these are great discussions, and that's basically how we learn from each other. Perfect. All right.
All right, so kind of moving on, same topic, but a little bit of a different angle for number 2, talking about female versus male speech. And so this is whenever within research, they were trying to make synthetic voice mechanisms or voice as synthesizers. And so the initial theory was that female voices are at generally a higher pitch than male voices. And so if they take a male recording and just pitch it up however much, they can make into a female voice. And so what they found is that it was really robotic and it wasn't natural. And so in the paper, they actually gave some of the recordings they did at the fair they had. And we're gonna see if we can get this open. But what they ended up discovering between the female and the male voices using the spectrograms and spectrographs is that female voices tend to be a bit more airy, so have stronger airflow, and the glottal stops tend to be a bit harder for the males than for the females. And so it's not necessarily just a higher pitch between different gender or different biological sexes, but there is actual different voice structures and voice intonations and mechanisms that men versus women tend to use more frequently than the other. And so we're going to start with 1953. This is the very first synthesizer that they created and kind of what it sounded like back then. I love you. And so then moving down the exact same one about 10 years later.
Welcome to the Stockholm Speech Communications Seminar.
So still not great, but a little bit better than what it was back in the 50s. And so here's what they ended up doing for the the male to female voice.
I am the standard male voice, perfect fall.
This is the result of trying to imitate a female voice by increasing the pitch, reducing the head size, and lengthening the open quotient.
Yeah, so even though they both sounded robotic, the female version still sounded a lot more technical, more mechanical, and there were a lot of differences in between what the male sounded like in the previous one, number 6, compared to what the female version was supposed to sound like in the pitching up one from the male.
So basically the message is that if you just like take a signal and change the sampling rate and make the pitch frequency higher, you're not going to be able to make it completely natural like female voice. So it has like a lot more to it in terms of the mechanics behind generation of different, male versus female voices.
Same for kids, right?
Yeah, so kids is even a higher frequency than women tend to be, but even still, you can't just pitch them up and make them sound like children. There are different intonations, breath, pitch, different things that play into it that make the voices distinct from each other. And so like we mentioned, all these different formats and the frequencies and things that go into it. And so all of this was important and mattered because one, it went into different types of voice therapy to help gender specific female versus male therapy of how you do those things for people who need help with voice or various aspects of it. But then also going into male versus female voice mechanics within technology too. And so having machines and automations that were not just poor imitations of what people were supposed to sound like, but finding different ways to actually produce real life or more realistic voicing options for people who are deaf or have difficult time producing speech or whatever the technology would have been used for. So moving on to the third one. So this is where we got a lot of moving more towards the imaging. And so this is whenever X-ray started to become more prominent within the field and trying to figure out how the tongue and how the mouth moves in a way to produce different sounds. And so initially just using X-rays and palatography. And so that is basically just putting charcoal or some kind of dye in the roof of your mouth and then making a sound and seeing where the dye transfers onto your tongue. And that's kind of where they assume that the sound, that's where they assume that your mouth produces a sound whenever you're making it. And so these were really limited in what they're able to view because they only were able to see a left versus right. There wasn't a lot of movement or a lot of visualization of where the tongue would go in terms of going forward, backwards, up or down. It was very limited in what they were able to see. And so eventually we ended up getting into MRI and more 3D imaging and realized that the tongue is actually able to move different areas and localize parts of the muscle more independently than we thought. And that's kind of where we realized that is more complex and how you do motor movement, muscle movement. So for instance, making an L sound, there's different types of L's of where you move your tongue to the side of your teeth versus the front of your teeth and various aspects of that, of being able to see how your tongue can localize and move and twist in various ways that you wouldn't be able to see with an x-ray or with like an ink blot, pretty much is what they were using at the time. And so this would help with people learning how to do muscle coordination or tongue movement coordination of people that had different motor speech and planning disorders, and also modeling for different disorders for breathing, respiratory, speech, and swallowing as well. And so the fourth myth that they end up going through is that speech is limited to less than 500 kilohertz within sound frequencies. And so this initially started out because of the invention of the telephone and bandwidth for telephone frequencies. And so they're trying to figure out a way to make it work that wouldn't overwhelm the infrastructure. And so whenever they did it, they found that if you cut off at a certain point, either cut off higher or cut off lower, you're still going to lose about 35% of intelligibility. And so it didn't really matter where they cut the frequencies off. And so they kept the bandwidth at 300 to 3,500 or 300 hertz to 3,500 hertz, assuming that you could distinguish an F or an S just based on context rather than actually hearing the sound over the phone or over radio waves. And so what they end up discovering is that speech is actually meaningful above 500 kilohertz. And so things like fricatives and stops, like what we talked about for F, Z, V, and stops like T, D, P actually are above 500 kilohertz. And so for everybody in audiology, all like the speech banana and the hearing frequencies of where the sounds are available. And realizing that a lot of those higher frequency sounds are above the limit where they had cut off for telephone use. And then also that a lot of emotional cues. And so a lot of the intonation and tone of your voice comes out around 8 kilohertz. And so a lot of things that are missing in conversation are actually above the cutoff threshold for where they found it. And so having all of these things, it created a challenge to increase bandwidth and increase intelligibility over telephone and radio waves. And it also helped with speech intelligibility and speaker identification over telephone systems and emergency call systems that were being used at the time. And it also helped with creating technology to be able to distinguish and detect different sound frequencies.
So that's the reason why when you call the bank, you have to just spell your names on letter by
Yes.
letter, because over the phone, because of that sharp frequency ranking the telephone line, some of the spectrum. So sometimes they can confuse an S with an F sound, especially for high frequency ranges. So you have to tell them like F as in Frank, S as in Samuel, or something like that, right? So
Mhm. Yeah, and so kind of going along the same idea of that sounds are varied within speech production and motor planning. The way that you produce speech can also vary within each person too. And so the initial thought is that if you produce the same sound, you make it the exact same way physically every single time. There's not a lot of variance in what your tongue versus your throat versus your mouth will do. And they ended up doing different imaging and realizing that that's not true. The same person can make the same sound 10 times and get 3 or 4 different variations of how they made that sound physically. And so they end up seeing that different features, so the way that your tongue is placed, the way that your vocal tract is pushing air out will vary, either due to co-articulation, so like we mentioned earlier, of being able to impact one sound by the sound coming after it, or also timing of, how you say a certain sound or how your body will coordinate different ways of moving your tongue and your mouth at a certain point in time. They also found that your brain will go through a feedback loop and it'll find the easiest way to produce whatever sound you're trying to make. And so if it's easier to produce the S sound with your tongue going up versus going down, it'll do it that way instead if it learns it. And there's also speaking rate can have a difference, and also surrounding sounds, co-articulation, like we mentioned, and feedback. And so your brain will go back through a loop within yourself and it'll hear different way that it's producing a sound, and then it might change it just based on a number of various factors. And so within every feature that they had looked into, there was not one aspect that was unmovable or unchangeable. Everything was varied in some way, shape, or form in some capacity of it. And so it shows that the brain is very complex and it's constantly adjusting and compensating for wherever the environment is going on around it. And so on the same thought for number 6, the vocal tract shape will only produce the same sound. And so if your vocal tract is shaped the same way, the same sound will come out every time. So kind of the opposite assumption of the previous one. And so this graph is also within the article for today. But if you look here, the very top row is the average of these 4 different trials below it. And so you can see here how trial 1, 2, 3, and 4 all varied from each other, producing the exact same phrase. And then once they average it together, they make a relatively similar graph and similar image of it. But within each one, there are differences that are noticeable between how you produce the same phrase over and over again. And so what they ended up finding was that you can make the same sound a number of different ways. And so one thing that you learn in grad school for an SLP is that you can produce things like T, saying putting your tongue at the top of your teeth versus the bottom of your teeth. And same thing for D. Some people will say it one way, some people will say it another. And so the way that they tested this was they did something called block bites, where they would put like a rod or something at the back of the molars and have them produce different vowel sounds. And they took the block bite out and had them do the same vowel sounds again. And they found that with or without the bite, they still produced the same vowel sound, and they were able to adjust and move their mouth and their tongue in ways to make the same sound regardless of how it was shaped. And so, yeah, on the same side of it, speech is not just a one-to-one, but there's a lot of different physical outputs to make the same sound. And so this was a big turning point for clinical research and clinical therapy for people that had a lot of different speech disorders and speech sounds, so stuttering, apraxia, aphasia, and realizing that there's not just one right or wrong way to do it, but finding different ways to help with ease of speech and comfortability with speech production. So finally, the last myth. Oh, yes.
But do people have like a propensity for one that you see with majority?
Usually, yeah. Typically, there is. For whatever reason, I'm not sure. I haven't read the literature of that part of it yet, but people typically will tend to do it one way or another. Yeah. But like anything, it's a muscle and you're able to learn multiple ways to do it. It's not like you're stuck with one thing or a different way. That's where a lot of accent modification therapy comes in, of learning how to produce the same sound a different way and being able to do it.
So it's the difference between 5 and 6 that 5 is talking about, like how you are changing your muscle and everything is going to be different each time you produce a sound versus like what it comes out. Like when I say like Bob or something, the sound, the perceiving of the sound is different. Yeah. So 5 is saying essentially that you can do the same movement however many times and produce a different sound, even though it's not perceptible to us. It is perceptible mechanically. Of like if we do a sound wave test, we can see the differences. Yeah. And then 6 is saying that you can produce the same sound in different ways motorily. And so one is an auditory perception, one is a physical perception.
But it seems that the variability is an important, actually inherent characteristic of both the motor system, because the motor system doesn't need to be like solid, needs to be actually able to produce multiple different variations of the muscle configuration, because it's important for learning, adaptation, and calibration. And also somehow magically our auditory system evolved to have some level of perception boundaries, actually has a little bit of a elevated sensitivity, or an adjusted sensitivity to a way that again, it can still perceive some level of variation. As long as it's not too far away from that threshold, you can still like perceptually recognize it as the same word or vowel sound, despite the fact that from a production part and acoustical measurement, there might be a slight variation. Right?
It's almost like discrete versus.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So there is some level of robustness in terms of the perception, as long as it doesn't fall outside of the boundaries, right?
Thank you.
Language. And for example, said different pronunciation.
Like different accents.
The languages. Example, Persian people say cheese, Turkish say cheese. It's the same.
Yeah, and so that would be different production of the sound almost, because the ch versus the t, even though it sounds similar, it's like it's still the same sound semantically, but the production of it would be different physically. Yeah. So like the semantic thought of it of like N in English versus the accented N in Spanish. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But also keep in mind that when we grow up in different language cultures, auditory system perception also evolves in a different way. So sometimes we may label something as the ch in one language, the ch, which is not the same exact configuration of the production of that. So there are a lot of variabilities across languages and cultures. And phonetically speaking, sometimes they actually get labeled as a different consonant sound if the pattern of the configuration of the muscles is distinguishable from what other people would generate or use together.
Yeah. Like there's one sound in Arabic I know that's like that there's a oh my computer died. There's a certain sound in Arabic that is a like the normal K in English, but then also a more glottal or deeper throat K in Arabic. And so to people who didn't with it, it's very subtle and indistinguishable. But if you did, then
I was thinking about something similar like color. But we can see the same color, basically the same color.
yeah, so like the perception is varied. Mm-hmm.
That falls out of that range, so we start seeing like we pronounce this Spanish.
Yeah. Yeah, the auditory perception and the production is different just based on what you grew up with. And that goes back into neurodevelopment of speech and language and childhood, different aspects of that, which is a very different conversation.
And also sometimes your production get affected by the way that your auditory system perceives the sound. You go to a different language, you feel like that you're producing it sound very similar to the native speakers, but it's probably because you hear the word differently.
Yeah.
Because your auditory system was shaped differently in that language culture, right? The original language. It's different from the second language.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I struggle with because I'll be trying a new word and I'll say it and they're like, no, it's like this, and they'll tell me and I say it and I don't hear the difference.
It's the same to you. Yeah.
Like I'm like, aren't I saying that?
So again, like this whole big picture view, like classically people thought this is a motoric issue that people cannot change. But now we talk about the fact that it's all about sensory motor play. The way that you perceive is going to affect the way that you produce and vice versa. Like the way that you produce is going to reshape the way that your auditory system is going to perceive the sounds, right?
Yeah. It's like working with kids with articulatory disorders of one of the first steps is making sure that they have sound discrimination of can they determine what a T versus a D sounds like before they can produce it. And so it goes back into the feedback and the sensory awareness of can they hear it and then can they feel a difference in their mouth or in their body whenever they're producing it and then actually working to make those sounds. There's various steps of like the feedback of going back into the very first slide of talking about how speech isn't just the vocal and verbalization of it, but it also starts back at the motor planning, at the thought formation, and then also at the feedback of when your body and your brain will hear it again, of what is it processing and what is it perceiving. Yeah, we got one more. The last myth within the paper is that acoustics and aerodynamics or airflow are separate within speech. And so there were 3 different synthesizer models that were created. The first one was articulatory synthesizers, and this was basically trying to model the position of mouth, tongue, lips, different things that work within articulation. Formant synthesizers modeled resonance and anti-resonance, so trying to find where the frequencies were and where the dead space, the white space was in between sounds. And then the last one, the concatenative synthesizers string together pre-recorded speech sounds. So for instance, if someone recorded every single sound of the English language with co-articulation sounds into it and then strung it together, and then that's basically how they produce language or produce sounds. And so that is the most accurate one for English language, but it's all or for language production in general, but it's also one of the hardest ones to do because you have to get every single sound within that language, including every co-articulated sound with it, to be able to make it sound accurate and sound human. And so initially, people thought that airflow and acoustics, so being able to actually produce the sounds in the airway and the sound waves were separate. what they ended up finding that they're very actually tightly intertwined and interweave together. And so there were different models that were stating how it's basically like a circulatory model of whenever one goes, it triggers the other and it keeps on going. And so here we have what the initial version was. And so this is the acoustic wave, the one-dimensional, where it's basically a tube of air comes in. The tube is of whatever size you need it to be to make a sound. Then airflow comes out producing that sound. And this kind of circuit they have going into it, it's very circular of it goes in, it goes through the waveform, and then it comes out whatever sound you need it to be. Whereas here, this is one of the more complex vocal cord synthesizers, and this is where you show the actual variability of the nasal tract, the vocal cords, the oral tract, and different ways that air and resonance play a role together into producing all of the different types of sounds that play into it. And this also takes account for mouth movement and mouth shape, tongue movement, if your tongue is twisting or lifting or stretching or squeezing, whatever it might be coming out into that way. This is also within the paper if you want a better view of it. And so seeing how these models can go into different forms of research and clinical support, and that we can learn how people produce speech and produce air. So people who need respiratory therapy and vocal therapy can play a part together, and it's not isolated and you're missing half the puzzle, but you can have all of it playing a role together to improve clinical therapy and clinical models that we have. And so all of these things is just various history, research history throughout time, and seeing how with new technology, new discoveries were made. And so versus 2D versus 3D models, having technology improve, telephones improve, and how we're able to use that to shape and learn how speech occurs in the body and within different parts in perception, production, and awareness. And then, there are a lot of the things that are newer within research are still being debated about. We're not entirely sure how it works, just because we don't know everything about the brain and about motor mechanisms. And being able to, the brain is one of the least understood parts of the body and parts of the world, actually. And so being able to figure out all these different things with increased technology will continue to advance in the world. That's all I got.
This is fantastic. This is great. This is how we want the class to be. Just like a general comment for everybody, because we're gonna have like 4 presentations each session. Just try to make sure that you keep it within like 30 minutes, and it's fine to have like conversation and then, questions between the slides, but if you can keep it until the presentation is over, and then we're gonna have another 5 minutes for discussion, that would